for Lighthouse Technologies. That's my mug there on the screen. Some housekeeping issues. First, to get started here, today's webinar will be recorded. Everyone is on mute. Questions will be fielded after the presentation. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat section, chat with the presenter, box on the left side of your screen, and feel free to ask them whenever you like, and we'll save them up toward the end. However, if you do have a technical problem during the webinar, please use chat to notify us, and we'll work to get that rectified for you as soon as possible. A little bit about our presenter. Julie Hagan is a practice test manager with Lighthouse Technologies with over 20 years of software industry experience. She served on a number of global multi-million-dollar large-scale software initiatives and ERP implementations, and she's skilled in business development and practice management. Julie also excels in tailoring processes to a metrics-driven, risk-based methodology. So without further ado, we'll jump right in, and I'll turn it over to Julie Hagan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for choosing to spend part of your day here with us. I appreciate it, and I hope you find it valuable. So if you've attended other Lighthouse webinars, and I think some of you have, you'll know that we like to be pragmatic about the way we talk through some of these difficult topics. So that's how we intend to walk through it today. We'll talk about the why, the what, and the how, and most importantly, what you can gain from it. So with that, we'll dive right into the why. To get where you want to go, first you need to know where you are. So we've all heard this many times in our career and our lives, so the phrase isn't new, but it's really just that simple. Most of us want to improve, and it's hard to do that if you don't first know where you're starting from. So these are some of the things that testing organizations are often dealing with, and we at Lighthouse know that firsthand, for sure. So first and foremost, it's hard, and I say that a lot, and the reason I do is because I think it's really important to just acknowledge that it's hard. It's okay to say that. We've got schedule constraints in our world. We have lots of external demands on our time, and it can drive us to operate in a very ad hoc way.
And we're at the end of the food chain.
And we're at the end of the food chain, exactly. Even in Agile, we're still at the end of the food chain to some degree. So what happens when we operate in an ad hoc way is that we drive inconsistent and unreliable results, which just causes a loop of additional churn. So it's about finding a way to get out of that loop, quite frankly, because nobody wants to be on the hamster wheel. We know that our customer, the business, they always want more for less because they're getting pressured as well. So they're frustrated, we're frustrated. A key value of an assessment is that it enlightens the business about what's possible. And once you begin to do that, everybody becomes just a little bit more collaborative in talking about the right way to move forward. Another thing that we often see is that test organizations can easily get misaligned or diverge from organizational goals. So, at the beginning of the year, we're all talking about strategy goals, and we kind of start out on the same path, but we quickly diverge. So this is a way to also identify that and figure out how to converge once again. And then back to just determining where you are. We're all at a place where we have a certain capability and capacity, but it's difficult to quantify and articulate that. So through an assessment, let's find a way to begin doing that. So again, those of you that are regulars to our webinars, and thank you for doing that, have likely seen this graphic before. So an assessment is a first step to improving your predictability and efficiency, right? Because that's what it's about. We're trying to improve. So here's what happens. You have that yellow plan line there. So think of that as representing your project plan, your software delivery plan. And sometimes the stars completely align and your projects come in below the plan. So all those blue dots, think of that as the actuals. That's where your projects actually came in. So you'll see there that there are a couple below the plan line, but most of them are above, and they're above it to varying degrees because that's what tends to happen in real life, right? So as your test process maturity increases, then you become closer and closer, your projects begin coming closer to that line. And in addition to that improved predictability, you're also getting more efficient, which is why you see that curve drop down there as well.
So by the way, this is Jeff Van Fleet. I work here at Lighthouse as well, but one of the reasons that this chart's valuable for us is it gives us kind of, when you start this assessment, you kind of baseline where you are, and you at least you know where you're operating right now. 7 out of 10 projects or 7 out of 10 test plans, we overrun the testing phase, or we underdeliver on quality, or we make those are the results that are going on in the organization. And being able to actually plot this over time as you move down the path to maturity just helps you sell the organization to your management.
Absolutely. And we'll, I think, talk about that here a little bit later. Okay, so that's the why. Let's start talking about the what. So, testing, assessments in general, they sound like kind of a pie-in-the-sky phrase. So let's talk about what we really mean by it. So it's a formal, objective process that occurs in a structured way. So that's how we at Lighthouse like to look at this, is that it's objective and it's structured. So unfortunately, that does make it difficult to take this on internally, because you tend to lose that objectivity, and the structured method of doing an assessment might not exist. The expertise to do that might not exist in your organization. So it should be evaluating people, processes, and tools, and really identifying the gaps in those things, right? So again, that's another Lighthouse thing. We like to keep things really simple. So we're breaking it down, again, into people, process, tools, and we're going to dive into each of those things here. So you want an assessment to identify your organization's goals and objectives, right, and how you're currently performing against them, because you're looking for gaps that you can close and improve. So as a testing organization, you might have some goals that look like this. You might have some others as well. So some of those goals might be delivering a higher quality solution. So then you have to ask yourself, what's the definition of high quality? It's harder to define than you think when you start trying to figure out what level of quality is acceptable to your clients. You might need to get to market faster, depending on your industry, right? So we're all about now DevOps and continuous delivery, continuous deployment. So sometimes in our test organization, we're looking for more speed. And I think we're always looking to increase efficiency and effectiveness, because it allows us to achieve some of these other goals. And the continuous cost pressure just doesn't go away. So we know that all of us are constantly in that mode of figuring out what are the trade-offs between cost, schedule, and quality.
One of the things that I wanted to add there, Julie, is when testing organizations are got a number of projects that they need to accomplish, typically their leadership understands that some projects are bigger than others, but there's not generally a solid way of sort of assessing or measuring how big is this project compared to this next project, and therefore what's the likely impact on cost, schedule, and quality due to those scope increases. And I think what we like to see in organizations, whether you have a consultant do an assessment or whether you're doing it internally, is you're trying to begin to take each of those projects that we saw in that previous chart, and you're trying to pay attention to what's the relative scope of that project.
Exactly.
And here we use a technique called function points, but there are other techniques that organizations use as well.
Yeah. Okay, so again, an assessment is about identifying the gaps, right? So let's dive in a little bit deeper into people, process, and tools. So we're a people-first centric philosophy here at Lighthouse, and that's because 65% of your improvement is always going to come from your people. Another 25% can generally be gleaned from process, and then 10% from tools, right? Tools are an enabler. They're never going to be a magic bullet. So we are always encouraging our partners and clients to not view them as such.
And conversely, hey, if you don't have good people, trying to make them follow a strict process, that's just like pulling teeth.
It just doesn't happen. And even with good people, it can be hard to adhere to a process. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. So back to people. So you're really looking, where are we skill-wise, and where are we with attitude and aptitude compared to where we think we need to be. So the thing about skills is it's really not that hard to get there via training. A relatively low training investment, believe it or not, can result in a pretty big ROI when it comes to your people. The attitude and aptitude, that's a little harder to train. So this is about evaluating whether or not the people in your testing organization have the right aptitude, the right mindset, if you will, the right personality traits to be good testers.
And they want to be there.
And they want to be there, exactly.
Right.
So once you know that, then you can make good decisions about where people best fit in the organizations in those roles to be best for them as well as best for the organization. From a process perspective, you begin looking at things like, okay, now I've got great people and I've got them in the right places, but does my team know what to do, A, and do they know how to do that, right? So then you have to dig a little deeper and think, okay, well, what kind of methodology am I in? Am I in Agile versus Waterfall? Is my whole team, are all my processes written in Waterfall and now I'm trying to be Agile and maybe I never updated them? If that's the case, it makes it difficult for people to know how they're supposed to do what they're doing. Similar to your test strategy. Maybe you're evolving from a manual test strategy to an automated test strategy, and you're somewhere in between, and now you have a hybrid. It's important to make sure that your processes reflect that and people know how to navigate their job in that kind of environment. And lastly, tools. That's down there in that 10% line, right? So what kind of tools have we brought in to enable all of this good people and process? So these are the areas that we'll be diving into deep during an assessment process. So with that, let's talk about how you go about performing one. So earlier I mentioned that using an objective eye and a structured process is really important. So this is the way that we view this here at Lighthouse. I'm sure there are other ways to peel the onion that are out there, right? But this is how we like to look at it. So we take a broad brush approach to start with and then hone in as we navigate through the assessment process. So the first step is kickoff and startup. So like anything, the planning is really important. So you want to get kicked off correctly. So at this time, you're clearly communicating the goals of the assessment itself to the organization because you need to generate buy-in. This will fail really quickly or get put on the shelf and never used if the right buy-in wasn't established from the organization as well as its key stakeholders at the beginning.
And as you all know who've been through any kind of assessments before, it's really critical to have senior leadership support here in any kind of organizational change initiative like this. So frankly, we'd recommend don't even start if you don't have senior leadership support.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and as Julie was saying, you want to communicate to everybody so everybody's got buy-in to the whole process.
Right. It's about your senior leadership. It's about your customers, the business. It's about organizations that you interact closely with, the development teams, the PMO, et cetera.
If you've got a client advisory board because you've got 5 or 10 or 15 customers of your product out there, we would encourage you to engage them in this process as well.
So there are goals of the assessment, and then there are organizational goals for your testing team, right? So you want to make sure that both are clearly identified as you begin kicking off this project so that you know what you're aiming for, to be quite frank. During this time, you'll identify 2 to 3 either completed projects or near completed projects to review as you go through this, and that'll make a little bit more sense as I get into the detail of why you'll want to do that. And you'll want to establish the schedule. So part of establishing the schedule is making sure that everybody knows what you're going to be asking of them. You're going to need them to participate. They'll be taking surveys. They might participate in interviews. So it's good to make them aware of that right up front. So let's talk about those surveys for a minute, right? So you want to send the survey out to 100% of the testing organization. Now, we recognize that 100% participation back is likely not going to happen, right? But you want to to try to get as broad a brush as possible. We're in the broad brush stage now at this point. We also want to survey those close stakeholders that I mentioned, folks in the business, folks in the development team, folks in the PMO, because what you're doing at this stage is getting a rough idea of issues and attitudes across those organizations relative to the testing team and looking for patterns. And those patterns and themes are going to allow you to further hone in as we move through this. So an example survey question might be, do you have the right training and support to be successful? You're likely to get many different answers to that question. You'll get some yeses, you'll get some nos, and it'll cause you to decide where you need to dig in further and who you might need to interview to get that deeper level of information.
Something I want to add here, Julie, is you kind of want to take the carrot approach versus the stick approach to getting people to sign up and actually fill this survey out.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
We've seen organizations oddly take the stick approach and make everybody fill it out come hell or high water. And, you get the results from that you might expect. So encourage your team, remind your team if you're going to go through a survey process, and then move on. If you get 65%, hey, you're in good shape.
Very good, in fact.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you've been able to determine some broad themes and patterns. That leads you to an interview process. So the interviews further validate what you learned from the surveys, so you can see how we're honing in as we move through this. So at this point, you will be choosing a certain percentage of the organization across various roles and in close stakeholders, like the business and like development that I keep referring to get some more detailed information. So what happens during this process is similar to the survey process. It's like a puzzle, and you're fitting all of the pieces together, and different people are going to give you different pieces of that puzzle, and it might cause you to go look for more pieces that you didn't know were missing. So that means that, maybe you didn't even identify a particular person and role to interview, but questions to answer, or answers to questions that you're asking lead you to do that. So it's an iterative process.
And it's important in the interviewing phase that you try not to ask leading questions, even though it's like really hard to do. It's still, you're looking for objective evidence, fact-based evidence from which you will draw conclusions.
Yeah, like Jeff said, it is really hard to do that. So spending the time building your list of questions and getting them peer-reviewed to make sure that they aren't leading questions is worth taking the time to do here. Okay, so we're back to the people. And we're back to the people because they're 65% of the improvement. So I'll likely bring them up a lot. So now we're looking at gaps in the people. So some ways that you can do that are through skills testing and attitude and aptitude assessment. So there are tools out there on the market, and we use some of them here at Lighthouse, that allow you to find out where people are from that perspective and what the gaps are. So it can sound a little overwhelming. Wow, how on earth do I figure out if my folks have the right personality traits and enthusiasm to want to be software testers? There really are pretty simple ways, if you will, to do that, and tools out there that will help you do that.
It's a tricky thing. The people assessment's a tricky thing because as software folks, we're not used to actually being tested like if we worked in healthcare or if we were a teacher or we're required to have certifications. So it's a tricky thing to, again, organizationally change your team to accept that we're going to test with the goal to be to convince the leadership to provide us the training we need so we can all improve. So it's a difficult area you just want to pay attention to. It's important but difficult.
Yeah, and I would definitely encourage you to think about doing the skills testing because, like I said earlier, you can close a training gap for a pretty low investment sometimes and get a big gain from it.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Okay, so now we've we've done a survey, we've done some interviews, we've assessed our people. Now we're going to start reviewing artifacts, right? So this is an evaluation of an organization's documents that they're using to enable the process. So there are really different levels of these documents. So at the higher level, which is what we're talking about on this particular chart, it's the big things, the strategy-related things. Are we agile or are we waterfall? And how do we need to work, depending on which one we are? Maybe you've got some projects in your organization that are agile and others that are waterfall. It's not an organizational thing, right? So sometimes you're working one way, sometimes you're working another. This is about your test strategy. Is it written down how your team is intended to work in different kinds of strategies, manual versus automated, et cetera? And then what's your release schedule look like? So that's really important to have laid out and make sure people understand, because that drives your organizational demand. So do you do sprints? How long are they? Is that consistent across the organization, or is it not? If it's not, why not? So all those things that you deal with every day, having them documented in an artifact is valuable.
In fact, on that point, if you're an agile organization and you do hardening sprints, the hardening sprint generally requires a higher resource level than a regular sprint does. Yep. And so and most organizations are laying this out, but the reason you're trying to do this assessment is try to understand the capability of the organization against the demand, and this is the demand. So capability and capacity, right?
Yep. No, and again, we're looking for the gaps, right? So it's about, do you know what it is, and is that documented somewhere in the artifact review? So these are lower level artifacts, if you will, more detailed artifacts. So these are the artifacts that guide what you're doing every single day. So, do you have a test strategy and planning document? If you do, then this is the time that you'd be reviewing it. Do you have architecture plans? Do you have a requirements traceability matrix? Do you have a process for how you manage your test data? So all of these things are what you're really looking at during this artifact review phase, and there are many more as well, right? So your defect management plan. If you calculate and produce metrics, what's your process for doing that? And does your team know how to do that?
And are you consistent between project to project, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so here's where, remember back at the beginning during kickoff and startup, we selected 2 to 3 projects that were either complete or near complete. So this is where that really starts to come in, because all those artifacts that we were looking at, they might exist, but are people really following them? So we're all guilty at some point or another, and I am for sure, of documenting what we're going to do, having every intention of doing it, but then things happen. Right? Things happen that interfere with your world, and you don't do it. So evaluating process adherence is important to do when you're determining the gaps between where you are, and remember, this is looking at where you are as compared to where you're looking to be. So it'll become an important part of the findings.
This is one of the most interesting things for me when we're doing assessments, is finding out what people are really doing, because as leaders, it's easy to set the framework for what you want them to do, but it's near impossible to ensure they're actually doing that work the way you set it up in the first place. And these kinds of assessments allow you to have that kind of visibility. And you get a whole varied different groups of answers.
Exactly, because once you have really good artifacts and documentation, it's easy, especially as leaders, to make an assumption that you're all good. And sometimes it isn't until you go through a structured objective exercise like this that you find out, under the surface, maybe things aren't as good as I thought. Okay, so now we're down to tools. So all of that great people and process can be enabled by tools. And tools are a great thing when they are used effectively and for the right purpose. So during this part of the assessment, we're looking at things like, how do you do defect tracking? And by tool, it can be an Excel spreadsheet, okay? But are you doing it, and how are you doing it? How are you doing your test case management from a technology perspective? Did you purchase a tool? Did you implement it correctly? Are you using it to the extent you thought you would use it, et cetera? So It's about more than just checking boxes to see if tools exist. It's about, are those tools being used effectively? And if not, what needs to happen to cause them to be used more effectively so that you can get the ROI from those investments that you made in those tool sets.
And if you're doing test automation, or a fair portion of your team's doing test automation, do you have proper frameworks in place and the technology there? And if you went with open source solutions and you made those decisions, are those open source solutions still being supported? And do you have a migration strategy in place for how you might migrate up to more current open source tools if they've gotten obsolete on you?
Yep. Okay, so we've collected a ton of information at this point, right? Because we did surveys, we collected findings from those surveys. We did interviews, we collected more findings from those interviews. It told us something. We assessed our people and determined their gaps. We reviewed all of our artifacts, and that gave us more information. So now what are we going to do with all this information? It can't just sit somewhere in a disorganized fashion.
Well, it could.
It could, but we don't recommend it. How about that? So the next step is to take all of this information and effectively boil it down into unique findings and recommendations that can be then turned into tasks that are actionable and prioritized. So at Lighthouse, we call that a roadmap to resolution, which is why you see that here on the slide. So that roadmap is then briefed back to all of the appropriate stakeholders, the test organization, the leadership, whoever you chose that was ancillary to your organization and important to this process, such as the business, such as development, et cetera. So we typically encourage organizations to create what we call a rolling wave type approach. And what that means is that change is implemented then in cycles.
Or agile.
Or agile, exactly.
Yeah.
It's iterative. Organizations can only absorb change at a certain rate. And we're always in a hurry in our industry. So it's hard to step back and remember that. You cannot eat the elephant overnight and expect to close all of these gaps in a 4-week time frame or a 12-week time frame, or sometimes even a 12-month time frame. It'll be difficult. So the size of the organization will directly impact the length of the improvement cycles, right? Because that just makes sense. So maybe you set up 3 months rolling waves or 6 month rolling waves or whatever's appropriate to your organization.
And I think most of the managers or CIOs and test managers or development managers have a pretty good sense of their people and their people's willingness to change. And what you're trying to do here through this whole exercise is show them a commitment that you are looking forward to improving and helping them improve. And this roadmap is kind of the culmination of, hey, here's what we learned, here's how we want to attack this, and getting their buy-in is really critical to that, which is why, Julie was talking about make sure we brief everybody back on this roadmap to resolution plan.
Yeah, nobody likes to be pulled into a discussion like this and then never hear anything more about it. Nobody likes that, right? Because it feels like it's a waste of time and nothing is really happening. So it's important to keep all those players engaged throughout the whole process, however you choose to keep them updated. So always when you get your roadmap finished, low-hanging fruit will fall out of that. There'll be some things there that will just present themselves as, wow, we could do that really quickly. We encourage organizations to do that, even if they're not the highest priority things, because you begin to show early wins and quickly demonstrate value back to the organization. Then after that low-hanging fruit, you can really look at the critical longer-term tasks and prioritizing those into your rolling wave or your roadmap plan.
Good.
Execute the plan. Please don't put it on the shelf. I'm begging you. It takes a lot of effort to do this, right? So if you've gotten this far and you've got an actionable plan that everyone feels good about, I encourage you to execute to it. And if the proper buy-in was established at the beginning, then executing to the plan should be the natural next step. So assuming that the plan wasn't put on the shelf and some execution took place, these are some of the outcomes that you can expect to have, right? So these align pretty well with some of the things we talked about at the beginning, the things that as testing organizations, the challenges we're often facing, right? So we should really expect to see reduced time to market and improved quality demonstrated by fewer defects. We should see increased cost savings potentially in the development area as well. Test and development are so linked that generally they get some advantages from a testing assessment and executed roadmap. The business should be less frustrated as the test process begins to mature and everything gets faster and lower cost. It drives a demonstrated ROI to them that they appreciate, right? And, it's all about efficiency. So at some point you may even be able to operate with fewer staff. So,
or get more work done.
Right. That's exactly right. Increase your velocity. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. So let's review what we did. So we talked through why would you do an assessment, right? So the things you might be facing that would drive you to want to do that and identify what your gaps are. We talked about what it is. It's an objective, structured process focused on people, processes, and tools to identify the gaps and how they might be able to close them so you know where you are.
Hey, let me add a comment about the why. That's just for me personally, this is the thing that I see resonate really well, is the why as an organization. Testers are QA, right? So we're really generally trying to improve anyhow.
Yeah.
But organizations above us don't know what they can and should expect from our organization. And a good reason to do an assessment is to establish a baseline of where you could be operating based on industry data and where your team is operating. So what's my test case productivity? How many minutes does it take to execute a test case or write a test case? How many test cases are we building per some kind of scope of a system, whatever size that system is? What's my defect removal efficiency? How many defects are we finding out in production out there compared to how many total defects are in the system? So there are real reasons to begin to sort of explain and justify to your leadership who don't live in our world every day what they could expect from your organization.
Yep, that's exactly right. And often what an assessment will uncover is that the organization doesn't know. They don't have any of the answers to those points that Jeff just raised because they're not collecting anything. So that can be a key finding from the assessment, is to start gathering that type of data. We often are out there helping organizations just start measuring themselves so they can get to a baseline,
right,
to be quite honest.
Right.
We talked about step-by-step how to go about performing an assessment from kickoff and startup all the way through to roadmap to resolution and execution of that roadmap. And then we talked about some of the expected outcomes that you should find from going through this kind of process and putting in all that good work.
Nice timing.
Yeah.
Okay.
We try to stay ahead of schedule.
We do.
Well, great job, Julie and Jeff. That was really informative. And we do have a lot of questions today, so I'm going to jump right in with them. First one is, how long does a typical assessment take, and what kind of investment does it require?
Okay, so that's a good question, and my answer to maybe the dismay of some folks is going to be it depends. And the reason why it depends is because it's directly tied to the size and complexity of the organization, right? So it takes time to do those interviews and some of those things we were talking about. So the more people you have to interview and collect and organize the findings from all of those activities, the longer it's going to take. But I'll give you a range. So generally, the right range should be in the 4 to 12 week kind of area.
And just to give you some sense of scope, just for us, when we've done assessments before, I think we found as few as 300 to 400 findings and as many as 3,000 to 4,000 findings. So it's very dependent on the organization, and frankly, it's dependent on the openness of your people to talk about the problems and challenges they're facing.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so good. And then we had a question. Don't the processes need to be understood first before you can determine if the people are in the best position to succeed?
So that is a good question. So there is a chicken and egg kind of thing. But we believe it is about the people first, right? Because what happens is it doesn't matter how great the processes are and how good the documentation is. People who don't have the right aptitude to be doing what they're doing or the right skill set are going to have a hard time following them. So, Jeff, I don't know if you want to weigh in there, but I guess my personal opinion is that you would still lead with the people.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, it does depend heavily on the size of the organization.
Yeah.
So if I have a 5-person testing organization versus a 250-person testing organization, they play a lot differently, right? So the smaller teams tend to be much heavier dependent on the people knowing what they're doing already, and you won't have the budget to invest in heavy process development. So it'll be kind of a chicken and egg. You won't be able to do that, nor would you want to do that. But as you get up to 10 and 15 and 20 testers, you're going to want to standardize those processes. And so do I think the processes need to be established and in place? I really don't. Not in our experience, I don't. Because a lot of people come to the, as you said, Julie, come to the table with the right attitude and aptitude. If you're, and you know, we do attitude and aptitude testing here just to get into the company, and then on top of that, we do skills testing to be able to work on a project. So there's tools and techniques that can give you that insight that are completely independent of your specific processes, but they do depend on general principles, right? We make them go find real defects. We make them record the defect. We make them write a test case that would have found that defect, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, agree.
Hope that helps.
So there's a question, that connects with that as well, which is how do you recommend getting people to open up and be candid during the interview to remove the fear of retribution in case they answer the wrong way?
So everything.
Beer.
Beer.
Just kidding.
So everything's anonymous, and you know it is about the messaging. You know the team has to believe that it's anonymous, right? And it's dependent on the culture of the organization. So
and trust.
Right?
Exactly,
right? So if we're assessing an organization that has a low level of trust, it is going to be difficult to get candid responses.
Yeah, in fact, a good example for us is, and one of the first times, like in 2004 or something like that, when we assessed an organization, it was a big organization, 200 plus people. They were really skeptical that we weren't going to try to identify specific people and therefore use that data to get them fired. And so we had to go in and convince their leadership team that we weren't even going to tell them the actual individual scores and the individual answers. We were only going to roll it up. So as part of our process, and we would recommend this if you do it internally, don't attribute a fact or a finding to an individual, because you want to validate it across 2 or 3 people anyhow, so don't point it to an individual. But if you're doing people assessments and you're if they're worried, like they will be, about being singled out in that people assessment, you got to convince your organization that we're not going to actually look at the individual results, which is easier said than done, but it's still critical, and you really just have to be sincere in front of the testers to tell them that we've got their back and that we won't disclose it. So that's how we've handled that. It's a great question that comes up all the time.
And that's how we handle anonymity, like Jeff said, even from interview responses. I mean, yes, the interviewer knows who they're interviewing, but the findings are not rolled up and attributed to any specific person.
Okay, I think that also answers another very similar question, which is how do you ease the perception that the assessment activity is not a process to evaluate individuals on their specific performance? So I think you've addressed that one as well.
Good.
Yeah?
We're efficient.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I think you did. So another question is, to use your phrase, we're an ad hoc testing organization. What's the first thing I should do to get started?
You know, I always come back to people, and my belief is that, you know, objectively evaluating the skills as well as the attitude and aptitude is a great first place to start, because you can close the skill gap so quickly and for such a low amount of investment sometimes. Or maybe even just moving somebody from a test role to a BA role, or from a BA role to a test role, depending on how your organization is structured, you know, can suddenly bring great benefit if the resource prefers doing that kind of work and are better suited to it.
And the only thing I would add to that is the assessment process is one that we recommend you do on a recurring basis. So when Julie was talking about you build a roadmap, you go through this whole process and you build this roadmap, and it's a rolling wave kind of plan. We'd recommend that you do sort of a mini check. Let's say you had a rolling wave plan that was a 3-month wave. Maybe you do a mini assessment each of the quarters, or each 3 months, and then annually you might do something bigger. So if you're a smaller or an ad hoc testing organization, I think getting started is the key to this. So, and as Julie said, people first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can an assessment be done in-house, or does it normally require a third-party consultant?
It really is most effective with a consultant or third party, and that it's about people feeling safe enough to be honest about what's really going on, and we've talked a lot about that through this Q&A process, and I'm glad that we are, because it's kind of the elephant in the room, you know, so I think it's good to just talk about it. People need to believe and feel safe that they can be honest in the feedback that they're providing, and they just tend to be more honest with a third-party organization versus internal leaders or internal team members.
And frankly, true or not true, I mean, the internal team knows what's going on, and they've probably been telling their leadership how to fix it and what they need to fix for months or years, and it's not really being effective. And by bringing an external consultant on, they may not be smarter at all than your people, but they have credibility because they've looked across multiple organizations, and they can take and anonymize all that data, all that data, and present it up so that at least the message that the people have been trying to say is getting up there.
Okay, good. So why? Another question is, why wouldn't you also include people outside the testing organization to get their perspective?
Oh, you would. You absolutely would. So as part of that kickoff and startup process, you're identifying those ancillary organizations and people as well that are key to gaining the right perspective. Yeah, you would.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Although we did say 100% of the testing organization, so I can see why that might be confusing.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, thanks for the clarification. How would you recommend selling this to upper management?
So that's about, I think I used the term earlier, enlightening them to the possibilities. So that's quantifiable projected improvement. So one of the things that we like to do here at Lighthouse right up front is establish a baseline based on all this information for how the organization is operating today. And then you can forecast, if you will, improvement over a period of time to estimate where you can get to from quantifiable things like cost, effort, schedule, quality in 3 months, in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And that's generally pretty effective in selling to upper management.
Plus this provides them a structured approach to improvement. So the management's probably been asking for more and giving them less budget to accomplish the work that they have, and they're looking for the test leaders to give them a plan of how they're going to go make that happen so that it's believable. Because everybody knows you can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. So now this is a different approach to try to gain those efficiencies and improve the effectiveness of the organization. And as Julie said, it's objective.
Right.
Okay.
And quantifiable.
Excellent. So we have two more we have two more questions. What's the basis for your evaluation? Do you use industry standard models or your own proprietary good practices?
I would say both.
Yep.
So it depends on which thing you're evaluating, right? There are definitely some industry standards that we compare against when it comes to where an organization is versus where they would like to get to. And then in other areas, it is a little bit more subjective around our best practices.
Yeah. We build our approach on ASQ and IEEE, and frankly, the PMI are three of the main inputs to our methodology here. I mean, but if you're doing it internally here, you still there's TMMI, right? There's a lot of approaches to assessing your organization that you can look at.
Okay. And last question. What criteria are used to determine the level of criticality of the findings or to ensure proper prioritization?
So that's about working back with the stakeholders. So based on our experience, we will have recommendations around priority, but the organization has to agree, right? So when these roadmaps are built based on, how you want to prioritize the actionable tasks that have come out of it, it's a collaborative effort.
Right. I mean, so there are a lot of questions that we go through in our process that indicate confusion. I'll give you a really good example. So one of the customers that we assessed, the guy who hired us, we had to go back as part of the assessment and tell him his people view him as a tyrant. That was a difficult conversation to have, but it was critical that he understood that nobody trusted him in the organization because he waffled around all over the place, and we gave him specific examples. So there will be things that will pop out, like maybe not as obvious as that will show that it's critical. But as Julie said, most of it's going to be driven toward alignment with the business objectives and how you're going to work your way there, low-hanging fruit to critical things.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, let me ask you, based on that response, how did he respond to you?
Oh, great. That's a good question. Actually, really well, because they hired us to do the job, and one of the questions that we always ask is, how do you want us to convey to you bad news? Because there's going to be bad news. And they told us, here's what I want you to do, talk to me personally or whatever they want to do. In his case, one of the reasons that they viewed him as a tyrant is because he beat his people up in public in meetings. So he had us, one of our folks, personally sit with him in those meetings and then coach him after the meeting on how he managed his people and give him an independent sort of, if you will, HR insight into how you're treating your people and why you treat some people well and other people not so well. And he took that and he dove right in. And frankly, after it took several months, right, because it takes time to build trust back up. But he built a lot more credibility back with the organization moving forward in about 6 months after that.
So that sounds to me like that's evidence that the process actually works, and it goes back to some of the earlier questions about how do you get people to trust the process and that you're not going to single people out. It sounds like it comes full circle there in that the assessment actually did uncover things that people could do something with and it enabled the organization to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point.
Okay, great. Well, that's the end of our time together today. Thank you very much for attending. Julie is standing by to answer your questions. She can be reached at 937-458-0055, extension 328. Also, we're available via email and online, so we'd love to hear from you. And if you have any further questions, let us know. We will be sending out a link to the archive of this webinar so that you can listen to it at your leisure in the future. Thank you very much for attending again, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.